Warhammer 40,000 Space Marines is a third-person shooter that throws you into the role of Captain Titus as his armies struggle to defend their world from an invasion of orcs who will stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. When it comes to gameplay, it shares a lot of similarities with Gears of War, but branches out, and instead of solely relying on shooting, you've got a pretty extensive amount of melee attacks that quickly flip the game into a beat-em-up. And it's this constant juggling between shooting and fighting that makes Space Marines so much fun. When it comes to the combat, you have an attack and stun button, which can be used to devise several different combos with. Enemies who have been properly stunned will have a circular icon above their heads and will be ripe for an execution. As you would expect, these are often brutal and savage actions, and when you throw your melee weapons into the mix as well, it makes for some truly gut-wrenching gameplay. When you're not up close and personal and hacking away at your enemies, the shooting is pretty solid and provides you with many different weapons to make use of, such as the melter gun, which is this game's answer for a shotgun, or the las cannon, which is a high-powered sniper rifle with limited ammo, and many more that are all built for certain situations. What helps spice up the gameplay even more, the different enemies you'll come across, as each of them pose a different threat. From the fast and nimble to the slower and more powerful, they can appear at any time throughout each mission, which demands that the player thinks on their toes and makes use of each and every option within their arsenal. To sum it up, Space Marines boasts a very fun and engaging campaign, and if you're a fan of Warhammer, this one is an absolute must. Binary Domain is quite possibly one of the most overlooked and underappreciated games from the 7th generation. Developed by the same minds behind the Yakuza series, it's a third-person squad-based shooter that brings some incredible ideas of its own to the table. It all takes place well into the future and follows Dan Marshall and his team of elite soldiers as they work to counteract the threat of untraceable androids who have seemingly embedded themselves into society. I won't go into too much detail, as the story is surprisingly one of the better aspects of the game that's perfect to play through without knowing much before jumping in. Now, on the gameplay front, Binary Domain is your standard cover-based shooter, but what helps mix it up is the huge focus on team tactics that lies at the heart of the action. Known as the Trust System, it sees you issuing voice commands through the use of your headset, but unfortunately it's not exactly accurate, and more often than not they won't respond or carry out your commands, but thankfully this can be remedied by simply using the controller instead, which I found a lot easier and quicker even when firing and running at the same time. Further helping Binary Domain exceed are the various light RPG mechanics sprinkled throughout the campaign. This mainly comes in the form of buying and upgrading a selection of weapons and armor for yourself and your team, and allows you to focus on creating a formidable force that's ready for whatever the game throws at you next. For a team that's solely focused on producing Yakuza games, Binary Domain was a welcome change of pace, and here's hoping that one day they decide to return to the futuristic shooter and build upon the fantastic foundation they created. The Oni Chambara series has always been known for its over-the-top action, women in swimsuits and gore, and Kagura on the PlayStation 3 is no exception. It's basically a hack and slasher that sees you taken on the fight as one of several characters, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that due to the adult theme of the game that there wasn't much else to it, but there's a surprisingly deep amount going on underneath the hood when it comes to the several mechanics that make it up. The gameplay is simple, and you're free to perform one of several combos and take advantage of a range of different weapons that all have their own pros and cons. From spears to boomerangs and swords, they all have a place on the battlefield, but what makes it quite unique is the blood system. The more blood and gore that your weapon racks up, the less damage it does, so you often have to pause to clean it off. Now, the concept of quite literally having to reload your sword might seem a bit stupid, but it adds an element of danger to the combat that doesn't often exist in most hack and slashers. You can't just rely on the most powerful weapon and muscle through each fight, because at one point or another you won't be able to do any damage without finding a safe spot to clean it off. When it comes to visuals, it seems that most of the budget went into the kills themselves, with each of them coming along with a decent amount of detail, as well as unique designs that give all of them their own style. The battlefield is often littered with several enemies at once, and the frame rate does a respectable job of holding strong as the action heats up. Unfortunately, it's all over pretty quickly, with the game only clocking in at about 6 hours, but with so many costumes, extra characters and weapons to unlock, there's still plenty of reasons to jump back in once the credits have rolled. I'm a huge fan of Fist of the North Star, may that be the anime or mangas that have released over the years, and when it comes to games, the franchise has also had its fair share of attempts to translate the brutal nature of the series, with Ken's Rage offering up one of the best. It plays quite similar to Dynasty Warriors and sees you tackling a range of different missions as you fight back against an endless wave of enemies that try to stop you dead in your tracks. Of course, there's a huge emphasis upon martial arts, and Ken has got many ways to get the job done, mainly through the use of 3 different styles that offer up several moves and abilities depending on the situation at hand. May that be when you're surrounded or picking off enemies from a distance, and for when the action really ramps up, you can take advantage of one of Ken's special moves that are all beholden to a meter. Whilst fighting and landing successful hits, this gauge will slowly rise, and when it's full you get to unleash one of 4 different abilities that have varying effects, such as being able to punch some poor sod 100 times in the space of a few seconds, to large area-based attacks that will chip away at large crowds, allowing you to turn the tide of the battle even when the odds are clearly stacked against you. When it comes to progression, the game does a great job as defeating enemies also earns you karma, and collecting enough levels you up, giving you skill points to spend and alter Ken's effectiveness over time. This aspect really drew me in, as for fans of the series you'll come across a lot of moves made popular by the source material, and getting to perform them and see them play out will put a stupid grin on your face. Overall, the game is not without its issues, but when it comes to pure, unadulterated fun, Ken's Rage is definitely worth picking up. Splatterhouse is a game that has roots leading all the way back to the days of the arcades, with the original releasing in 1988 and several sequels that would hit the home consoles of the time. After a long hiatus, the series received a reboot that once again saw you taking on the fight as Rick, as you don the wisecracking terror mask and chase down the infamous Dr. West, all in the hopes of saving your girlfriend who's been kidnapped. The story was never the series' strong point, and here there's no change in that department, but what helps set it apart is the bloody and violent gameplay that lies at the core of the experience. It takes the form of a beat 'em up as you make your way from one room to the next, gathering collectibles along the way and clearing each stage of enemies in a variety of gruesome ways. You get a lot to play with as you advance, ranging from meat cleavers and pipes to the severed body parts of your enemies, which can all be used to your advantage. Of course, you've got a series of basic combos as well, and with certain attacks working better for specific enemies, approaching each fight soon becomes a strategic affair, and not just about blindly bashing everything in sight. During the course of the game you get blood, the game's currency, and with it you can purchase new skills to use or boost your health, but also save it to perform one of the many splatter attacks that are basically your special moves. There's quite a few of them, and they are just as violent and brutal as you would expect, with many relying on quick time events in order to pull them off. They add a lot of spectacle to the game, and are likely to turn a few stomachs as they play out. When it comes down to it, if you're looking for a game that's not afraid to take full advantage of its mature rating, then Splatterhouse will be just the ticket. Ever since the first games on the PlayStation, the Twisted Metal series has prided itself on violence and destruction, and the 2012 reboot would take this premise to new heights and ultimately provide one of the best entries in the franchise. You're once again thrown into a tournament that sees its contestants fighting it out on the road in one of many different vehicles, with each of them armed to the teeth with a huge range of weapons such as miniguns and rockets that bring life to the absolute mayhem of each event. These range from the classic last man standing deathmatch to more interesting concepts like the electric cage match that sees you trying to take everyone out within a walled off space. There are also several racing stages in the game, and they are by far the most difficult. Not only do you almost have to drive perfectly, but you also have to avoid all of the attacks from your rivals, which makes for some truly hectic gameplay. There is a wide variety of vehicles, each with their own armor, speed and special weapons, as well as other traits like how quickly they recharge their energy bar. While the vehicles and weapons are important, the battlefields where all this mayhem takes place are just as significant. There's 8 maps in total, which range from ruined cities, open canyons to the rooftops of LA. Each of them managed to feel unique, and with several obstacles such as ramps and the destructible elements of each space, there's plenty of ways you can use them to your advantage. Due to its arcade-style nature, Twisted Metal will provide nigh on endless amounts of replayability, with countless hours of fast-paced action and destruction that's just as enjoyable to play today as it was back when it first released. The Godfather: The Don's Edition is essentially a retooled version of the PlayStation 2 game and comes along with a few changes and improvements that ultimately make it the best way to experience this forgotten classic. Based almost entirely within the time span of the first movie, The Godfather puts you into the shoes of an up-and-coming player in the Corleone family business who is seeking revenge on the Brazzini family for killing his father. You get to create him from scratch, and then once you're done, you're free to explore the 1940s recreation of New York City as you take on jobs and work towards rising in the ranks of the family. Now, as this is a sandbox game, the expected run and gun components are on the surface present, but it's not just a mere GTA clone, as it's also got a few ideas of its own, and this is mainly during combat. Hand-to-hand fighting is dealt with not by a single button, but by the right analog stick, much like EA's Fight Night. And sure, you could just pump wildly on the right stick, but you'd leave yourself wide open for counterattacks and a swift defeat, so taking your time and devising combos is the best way to come out on top. The same is true for the gunfights, as running into situations gung-ho will likely result in failure, so taking advantage of the cover system is the best way to help you stand your ground, as well as utilising one of the many weapons ripped straight from the film at the right time. To be fair, even these descriptions shed only a small amount of light on the combat system. There is a lot left unmentioned, as part of the fun of the controls is to learn new moves, executions and strategies that I'll leave up to you to discover. If you're a fan of the films or just open world sandboxes in general, then The Godfather is definitely worth playing. When it first released back in 2014, Killer is Dead didn't fare too well when it came to reviews and largely was received quite negatively. As a fan of Suda51's work, I didn't let that hold me back from picking it up, and I'm glad I didn't, as although it's clearly a bit rough around the edges, Killer is Dead offers an experience like no other, and it's all broken up into a series of episodes that follow Mondo Zappa, an assassin who works for a mysterious organisation as you hack and slash your way to the end. The gameplay is where it truly shines and feels like an evolution of the No More Heroes formula, and instead of just mindlessly mashing a button to win, the game throws in a whole bunch of tactics like ranged weaponry and emphasises the use of your dodge in defeating enemies. What makes the combat different from No More Heroes though is Mondo's cybernetic arm, which can morph into 4 different weapons that are unlocked through completing side missions. The 4 weapons require blood in order to be used that can be picked up from defeated enemies, but that same blood Mondo collects can also be used to heal himself, which creates a nice amount of risk versus reward. Besides from collecting blood from fallen enemies, Mondo can also earn yellow crystals that allow the player to unlock new moves and upgrade their weapons, which adds a little freedom when it comes to building him in a way that suits your style of play. If I'm being honest though, one disappointing aspect of the game has to be the boss fights, which never really put up too much of a challenge, and it's just a case of studying their movements and attack patterns and waiting for the right moment to strike. It would have been nice to have seen a bit more to them, but thankfully the minute-to-minute combat with normal enemies more than makes up for it. Overall, the confusing story and short length of the game do let it down a bit, but the gameplay is where it's at its best, so if you can find it for a cheap price, playing it is absolutely worthwhile. Siren Blood Curse is basically a reimagining of the first game on the PlayStation 2, with many alterations to the game's structure and improvements to its gameplay. It all takes place in a secluded Japanese village where a mysterious ceremony in the woods is accidentally cut short by Suda, a young man who takes on the role of the main character and soon finds himself wrapped up in a terrifying town. You eventually come to play as several other characters who are also trapped in the area and have been cut off from the rest of the world by a supernatural river of blood, where all of the village's inhabitants have turned into the Walking Dead. They will attack, chase, and even shoot you upon sight, so you must learn to efficiently and quietly sneak past them whilst trying to fulfill one of the many objectives each mission brings. To be fair, there's not that much variety in what they ask you to do, with most basically seeing you making it from point A to point B alive, or doing so while guiding along a companion. What makes Siren quite unique, however, is the inclusion of a mechanic known as sight jacking. It allows you to understand what a human or monster in the area sees and hears, letting you determine its location as well as gain knowledge of their activities and the position of obtainable items that can help you out. With the game promoting that you avoid enemies rather than stay and fight, this feature soon becomes your most valuable asset as you carefully plan your way forward. Not knowing what is out there and what could be out there is a feeling that Siren absolutely nails, and because of it, the level of unease you'll experience whilst playing it is off the charts. There really isn't anything else like Siren awe-inspiring, and in spite of its unusual control scheme, the immersive world of scares it creates is something you won't easily forget. If you could sum up Wet in one word, it would have to be ambition, as it's clear to see that a lot of thought went into the game, but several missteps do keep it from reaching the heights it aimed for, but not in a way that totally ruins the experience as a whole. It's a third-person shooter with several platforming elements thrown in as you take on the role of Ruby, a foul-mouthed mercenary whose no-nonsense approach adds a ton of humour to the story, and as long as she gets paid, she doesn't care what the job entails. If you've ever played the likes of Max Payne, you'll instantly feel familiar with the several mechanics that make up Wet, mainly the huge focus on slowing down time and using it to accurately pick off enemies, but where it differs is the use of Ruby's acrobatic abilities that also come into play, just as much as the shooting itself. Jumping, wall running or sliding along the ground on your knees, she is well equipped to outsmart the enemy, and getting to grips with these powers is at the centre of what makes Wet so enjoyable to play, regardless of some of its more shoddy aspects. This is mainly the difficulty, which is offset by Ruby's abilities, is there is no limit on entering bullet time, and you're also given an unlimited amount of handgun ammo, where at points it just feels like you're cheating your way through the game. Thankfully, it does feel incredibly satisfying to do so, but it would have been nice to have seen some limitations such as a gauge that forces you to use your skills strategically that would have added some more challenge to the gameplay. All in all though, Wet is still a solid game that doesn't overstay its welcome. With its great sense of style, replayability and explosive action, it's a real blast to make your way through, and with it still being available for quite cheap, it's definitely something worth considering. Well, that does it for another video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos that release every Monday and Thursday. You can follow me on all of the socials, which are linked below to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skillgen, Shuden, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Maximus, Scott, Alfred, Terry, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Curse Salaryman, Fake and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to check the video out. I'll catch you next time.